that is my life's motto. Do not dim your light. You're not here to do that. Let them get sunglasses. You're here to shine, and don't apologize for your light. Like, even if your idea about what you want is slightly vague, your idea about what you don't want is always more specific. So if it is that, reject it. Listen to your intuition.
If you find out what success means to you, you will thrive and never be stale. So practice being good at life and let your authentic self prevail.
You don't fit their understanding and their set of references and beliefs and experiences of what someone who looks like you, walks like you, talks like you should, could, or can accomplish. You know you've got champions around you when they can smell, sense, and intuitively know you're ready before you think you are. That's happened for me.
And a lot of times you've looked inwards. What do I really, really want to do? What ignites that light inside of me? And how can I make that shine brighter? No matter what other people say to me, I'm going to go for that.
Greetings, I'm Ashley Samuels Mackenzie,
And I'm Charles Parkinson,
and welcome to How I Became.
where we unveil the unscripted journeys of inspirational figures.
Hi, I'm Harjot Singh, and this is how I became Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann Worldgroup.
With a nature to question everything, this guest's journey has been about sidestepping the status quo. Starting his life in India and moving around a lot in his youth provided him ample opportunities to know himself and uniquely grow. Encompassing the notion that there is no cap to what you can achieve. Learning that you should never rate yourself on others' expectations, as that's just what they believe. Sharp wit, humour and wisdom, no wonder he's a global player. Ready to rise to any opposition, be that a perspective, a challenge, or a staunch naysayer. I hope you're ready for fabulosity and glitz, and a sprinkle of glam. Introducing Harjot Singh, Global Chief Strategy Officer at McCann Worldgroup.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
It's your life in a poem.
I love it. Can I just borrow that and use that as my bio?
Yes, that's a great idea. Yeah.
You know, the haiku of Harjo.
Yes.
It's perfect.
And before, you have a panel discussion or a talk,
Yeah.
Ashley can come on, do the poem, give you a proper intro.
I just make sure everybody else memorizes that.
Yes.
You know, put it on Lyric Finder.
Your life, we've broken down into 6 chapters, which we'll share today. Chapter 1, an international early life around the world. Chapter 2, a change in circumstances. Out of money, out of a home, needing a job. Chapter 3, you think I shouldn't go to China? Watch me. Chapter 4, from Toronto to New York City to London, rising up to a global role. Chapter 5, learning how to Marie Kondo your feedback. And Chapter 6, global CSO of McCann Worldgroup.
Yeah.
So let's just start. We're going to hear the story of how you became that role. But let's hear the background of McCann to begin with before we hear your story. Give people the context, the scale, the success, the influence this organization has in this world. What's the backstory to McCann Worldgroup?
Well, McCann Worldgroup is one of the most, storied and iconic agency networks in the world, in the history of the profession. It's been around for over 100 years, and you can't say the same for a lot of brands. You know, brands now, they live a lot. They don't live as long. And McCann's been around for over 100 years, more 112 almost. And, it operates in over 120 countries.
Wow.
And we work with some of the world's most meaningful, iconic, and important brands, whether that's MasterCard, whether that's L'Oreal, whether that's Microsoft. We work with brands that are important to people and that are changing the world and changing lives. and have been doing that forever. And we've been helping them do that in ways that are commercially and creatively very, very interesting and impactful.
What's fascinating there is not only do you work with L'Oreal, but in 1973, McCann New York launched the campaign for L'Oreal's colouring products featuring the line,
I'm worth it.
right?
Yes.
To explaining why they're willing to spend more on their hair.
Yes.
So the McCann are the makers of that. Not only that, Ash, I think you should read this, not me.
What
Yeah.
is it?
There are some things money can't buy for anything else.
There's
but
MasterCard. Yes.
Creators of that
yes.
too.
Yes. Just really, really, very iconic brand platforms. We call them brand platforms because they are exactly that. They have this amazing superpower to help brands remain current and enduring at once. And that's, you can see why that works with these kinds of examples.
And it was 1997 that McCann Worldgroup was formed, which includes McCann, or at the time, McCann Erickson Worldwide, and what would become MRN McCann, Momentum Worldwide, McCann Healthcare Worldwide, Weber Shandwick, and Future Brand. And that's the story of McCann Worldgroup.
Yes, it's continued to grow, as the marketing landscape became more and more, complex and, had creative demands and imperatives. We grew just as quickly with it to offer solutions to our clients that were just as impactful and just as creative and just as, path-breaking as their ambition and objectives were.
So this gives people watching and listening just the scale of this organization, that you are Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann Worldgroup. And we're going to tell the story
Yeah.
of how you got there. Let's take it all back to where things began. Tell us about where things began. Your father was in the army, which meant you traveled a lot. You're moving around a lot of places. Just tell us what your very early life was like.
Well, I was born in 1974. The jig is up. Everybody knows my age now. So I was born in 1974, and I was born in India. And it's interesting because for those of you who know, the history of the world and India and the economy and all of that, India only became part of the global economy once it got deregulated in 1990. So, the first 16 years growing up in a country where, it was really a reference unto itself, that is very interesting because you're in this country that's massive, you're a huge population, and you aren't part of the global economy, so to speak. It's not like you see all the brands that you see there today, for example. There was an Indian version of everything. So what that, in retrospect, what that teaches you by observation is to invent and be self-sufficient and look for solutions within the resources that you have that are available to you to create those kinds of, experiences and solutions. So, for example, there was no Coca-Cola when I was growing up in India, but we had our own soft drink called Thumbs Up or Campa Cola, and now it's become a huge thing with all the young people all over the world. It's a thing now, these drinks. But when I was growing up, we didn't have that. The only, there was Unilever was around because it was part of an Indian company called Hindustan Lever. So, for example, soaps like Lux were around, but the other product portfolio wasn't there. We didn't have any fast food restaurants. We never had McDonald's, but you had your own version of McDonald's. For example, when I was growing up, there was a fast food restaurant. It was called Hot Millions, and it wasn't McDonald's or KFC, but it had its own. It did what you would have wanted McDonald's to do for you as a kid if that was your jam. So partly, those 16 years were quite interesting because you're growing up in this world where you're aware of these references. And especially with my background and upbringing, I was exposed to what was going on in the world that wasn't available and accessible where I was growing up. So, for example, what that does is it creates this sense of not ambition and desire, but this very silent resolve. It's drip fed that, this, what I see, what I experience, what meets the eye, isn't the end. This isn't the boundary of what's possible, of what exists. So just having those references, having the awareness that what was around me wasn't the entire universe. This was just a little dot in what the rest of the world was. That was huge. It just drip feeds this sense of curiosity and ambition in you that you're going to actually see, experience, and accomplish, and maybe even have all of that. So that's how you grow up. You move every 2.5 years. And
what impact did that have on you? Moving every 2 to 3 years is a lot, especially at that age. You're constantly having to make new friends.
Oh, yes.
Get into a new school, how it works. What impact did that have on you?
Well, in retrospect, initially when you're a child, it's like, what's the expression? A fish doesn't recognize water. Like when you're a kid, you don't really know any different. When you're an army officer's kid, you're like, okay, well, this is just how life is. You just get up and go every 2-3 years, and you move to a new place, and it's a new home, and there are new faces, maybe a new language, maybe new sights, smells, food, new school, new teachers, maybe a new syllabus, maybe new friends, maybe new bullies, maybe new naysayers, maybe new teachers that don't like you, and new teachers that do like you, maybe new people that see you, and maybe new ones that don't. And so, it's really quite interesting in that sense. But when you're going through that, you can have two kinds of, my whole life, I've always looked at it and said, well, it could have been this, but it ended up being this. And I think you could experience this reality very differently and go like, oh, I have no childhood friends. Like, I literally don't. I would not be able to tell you, sit around people and say, oh, he's my friend since grade 2. Well, I don't have friends since grade 2 who I've grown up with, because I've never lived anywhere more than 2, 3, 4 years in my whole life.
It's hard to build those some connections.
But in retrospect, what that does do is every time you go somewhere, you can reinvent yourself. There's also that. So you learn, from a young age, what reinventing yourself is. What do you want to leave behind? What do you want to take forward? What do you want to, try out and, know that if you don't make it or if it's not going to work, that in 3 years you're going to be able to maybe leave it behind. Yeah. So there was no social media, at that time. So there was some pros and cons of it. It was that.
So you went to a number of schools. You went to boarding school for a bit. You lived with your grandparents.
Yes, for 8 years.
8 years. Is that in
India?
Bombay?
Yeah, in Chandigarh.
Chandigarh.
Yeah.
Okay. Where's Chandigarh?
It's in the north of India. It's it's very interesting. It was a city that was entirely designed and planned and built by Corbusier after independence.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the city that my grandparents lived in. It's the city I was born in. And I did live there for 8 years with them because at the time my father was posted in areas that weren't necessarily family friendly. Right. He had somewhat challenging, engagements and assignments with the military. So we weren't really accompanying him. So I did live with my grandmother. Those years were quite stable, so to speak. But at the same time, you're not really living with your parents, are you? So, yeah.
And when did you live in Bombay?
Oh, right after that.
So how old were you when you moved to Bombay?
Well, I moved closer to high school just before, and then I stayed there through, university. And so I think my teenage years were spent in that space, in that part of the country. And it was and of course I'd been going back and forth a lot because my father's sister lived there. We had lots of family there. So for me, Bombay was always my second home. There was a lot of back and forth, and then I lived there for a while.
And what people might not know is Bombay was the center of advertising
and film.
Yes. In India?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that like? Because this is where your advertising enters into your life, and you see, I guess, print magazines and
Yes,
adverts.
yes.
What was going through your mind when you were seeing these?
Oh my God. So yes. So, I loved magazines. And more importantly, I loved reading the magazines my mother subscribed to, not the ones my father read.
What kind of magazines were
Oh,
those?
well, fashion and those kinds of magazines. And what was interesting, so again, growing up, we didn't have Cosmopolitan, Vogue, all of this came to India much, much later. But we had our own versions of that. There was a fashion magazine, it was called Glad Rags. There was a women's magazine that was called Femina or Women's Era. And there was a film magazine called Stardust and Film Fair. It's still around. But there were those magazines that, we recognize that you say, oh, there's a Grazia or there's Vogue or Harper's and Queen or whatever. You had those versions there. So, well, my mother had plenty of those. And I loved going through them. And in those days, you'd flip through magazines and you'd see these beautiful ads, very clever copywriting, because I was always drawn to stories. So I wasn't one of those really sporty kids who wanted to go out there and play cricket and tennis and all of those things as much as my father wished and wanted and forced me to. My comfort came from just kind of, being with my thoughts, reading, going through magazines and imagining what that world is, And so you'd see these ads and you'd see this very clever copywriting. But at the corner of it, you'd see something that would say, Ogilvy and number 2345, da-da-da-da-da. Or something like that. You just didn't know what it was. But, I'm an extremely observant person. And there are many reasons, we'll get into that, why, with my background and my experiences, one becomes extremely observant.
Yeah.
You could argue, is it a form of hypervigilance because, you've had difficult experiences, whatever. That's for another part of this conversation. But suffice to say, I was very observant. And I'd see things like, it would say, Lintas, blah, 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 number 234. I just didn't know what that was, or Mudra, or there were all these names. But these ads were amazing. For example, clever copywriting, beautiful pictures. And then I started to think about what that is. Later on, in high school, or, close to when I was in college, and I got a job as a newsreader on the radio station to make ends meet, sort of. I realized those were what we called key numbers. And key numbers were the way in which an advertising agency identified that work came from their agency. So there was a code. It was almost like an artist credit at the bottom right corner of a painting. Because for me, I was so drawn to art, and I would always think, oh, maybe that's where you look for the credits.
Yeah.
Because they were such beautiful ads. I would say, oh, those credits are actually key numbers. And then I realized that these names called Lintas, Mudra, Ogilvy, these are actually the agencies where this stuff comes out of. I was like, well, I've got to have a piece of that. That's where I've got to make this. And I think that's how it started to, enter my consciousness. And then, of course, once something is in your consciousness and you pay attention to it, you end up manifesting it in your life in some shape or form.
You mentioned your father there. How was your relationship with him at this time?
Interesting. My dad and I, we have a good relationship now.
Great.
But when I was growing up, I really think it was kind of odd because, the ideas of masculinity and the idea of what it means to be masculine and a man, and it's just different. I've always kind of like rejected social constructs and tropes of how a woman has to behave or a child has to behave or families have to look, or, subconsciously and now consciously, I've just had an inherent, rejection to belong to and ascribe to structures, rules, and constructs that I've had no intellectual creative autonomy in creating in the first place. So for me, it was like, why do I have to fit into these boxes and shapes and constructs that I have had absolutely no say in making, or even have had no agency in creating them? So, for me, I obviously wasn't as articulate at that time, but I had these very strong feelings about wanting to reject just because you say so isn't the reason why I would do as told. I've always had that problem with that hierarchy and authority for that reason. And, he was in the army, had wielded a lot of authority because he's quite senior and was quite influential, whatever. But, he had a lot of, that was his reality. And, he kind of obviously respected rules, and that rules were his life and structure was his life. And I was just like, well, that's not what. So there was a lot of conversation and debate, and there was just a lot of, him just throwing his hands up and saying, I don't understand. Like I think I might have really frustrated him a lot. It might have been that way both ways. Yeah. So
sometimes when you're faced with like the opposition to how you think, it just fuels you to think that way more. Right?
Yeah, always. Because, I think depending on what kind of person you are, I think some people you can beat them into submission.
Yeah.
I don't personally think of myself as one of those people, but I really do think that when someone tells you why that things have to be a certain way, and they cannot explain in a way that makes sense for you, I don't think you're obliged to accept that. No. Obviously, I'm not, there's law and order. Yes, I'm not going to argue with why we have to, behave a certain way on the street and, on the tube and all of that. I'm not arguing with that part, but I'm saying, generally speaking, someone tells you, boys are supposed to behave like this and play cricket and come back and then do this, that, and the other and read Hardy Boys or whatever and not want to read, I don't know, Nancy Drew. Who said?
Yeah.
Or boys don't wear this, or this color is a girl's color, or this color is a boy's color. Who decides that? Who decides that both your socks have to match all the time? Like that was me as a child. Yeah. Why should I have to wear matching socks all the time?
I think that it paints a brilliant picture of Harjot.
I just argue with everything.
In his late teen, early life, disrupting the world. And clearly, it is great to hear. Now you have a great relationship with your father.
Yeah.
But at the time, two very different values. You want to break all the rules. He thinks you should keep them all. Yeah. And just very, very different.
Well, we still argue.
I'm sure. Which family doesn't? So you go to the Symbiosis Institute of Business Management and you do a business degree.
Yes, I do an advertising and business. I do 2 masters because I was in such a rush to get out of there.
Wow.
And the reason I went there is because I just had this urgency to kind of get it done with, because I knew this was just one more thing I had to do so that I could do what I wanted to do.
Which was make ads like that in the magazine.
And be out of this kind of like blind submission to kind of like, this is just it. It's just the way it is because it is that way. And I think I just knew that what's going to give me a competitive edge, because I knew at that point very, very, very early on that my ideas weren't enough because of my environment. I needed more, because I didn't want to just succeed on that stage. I didn't want to just succeed on the B chord, so to speak. I'm not saying that is the B chord, but for me it was. I said, I want more. So therefore I needed to acquire everything I could, which is within my means and my grasp, to have more and to be able to position myself to accomplish more. So I did 2 masters at that time. Wow. I didn't really, and then I read the news at night, and my whole point was I was very focused that that's what I'm here to do. And
get into advertising.
Yeah. And just,
So you get your masters. What happens next?
I go and apply for an internship at Ogilvy, because I was told that's the best agency. I said, well, then I just have to work at the best.
You have to be at the best.
I have to. I'm going to start there. And then, so I did go there. And obviously you apply to many others, but then they kind of tell you that, oh, we don't have vacancies, or, you're not the right fit, is what you hear a lot. And I was just like, well, I don't want to fit in, because the whole point was, every time you go to an advertising agency, I saw that very early on. They're all like, they'd give you this idea about how they talk about themselves. We make bold work. We make work that kind of like disrupts things or breaks conventions or makes people that sit up and take notice and all of those things. You can't do that stuff if it just fits in with everything you want to see and know. So when people told me that, I'll never forget this was first time that someone said, well, you're just never going to fit. You're just not a good fit. And I was just like, well, do you make work? Don't you want to make work that
Doesn't fit.
Yeah.
exactly?
Yeah.
What kind of work do you want to
Breaks
make?
convention.
And, basically, short of calling me smart Alec, that would have been a polite thing for him to say to me, but he wasn't as polite. And he showed me the door and thought I was too lippy. But then my point was, okay, well, that's how it works. So I did, do some research, and people told me, well, Ogilvy's the best shop here. It's the most globally connected. And I was like, well, that's what I want.
Yeah.
That's where I have to be. So I went there and I saw people. The good thing is they had structure. So I met lots of different people, account directors and people who I thought were, they had really important jobs because they had these offices. And I saw these ads that I'd seen in the magazine. They were framed in their offices.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my
You're
God.
like, I'm here.
This
There.
is where I
this is
have
where it comes
to.
from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
How cool.
and then I'd see them, and somehow I thought, oh, they're just regular people.
And you expected these maybe people like yourself, and
Or just
it's
people I thought they were like going to be really kind of different. And what was I thinking? And that was my point. I'm like, why would you waste any time telling yourself stories that where you want to go is full of people who are very different and just people you can never be like. They're just people who use their imagination to come up with really interesting ideas. And your imagination is just as valid as anybody else's. I just kind of had that. I felt that from the very beginning. And that's why some people liked me and some people thought I was just too, what was the expression? Full of certainty. Not overconfident, very certain. And, you're often told, you must be more humble. And I really did struggle with that. And we'll talk about that big aha moment I had about humility, which is just so overrated.
So paint the picture of your current life circumstance, because you grew up in in a great environment. You went to great schools, and I say great environment, but as you said yourself, it was privileged. You had lots of means. Everything was good. But at this time in your life, things had changed. Why had they changed? And paint the picture of your current circumstances.
As I grew up, I became more and more aware of, I think from a very early age, I was very aware of how different I was from everyone around me. I was different from my cousins. I was different from people around me. I didn't relate to a lot, and I didn't hide that. And I was different. I wasn't a regular boy like many of those other boys around me. And so you got bullied and you got kind of like picked on. And I never got discouraged by that. I just had this silent resolve in me like, oh, I'm just going to be out of here and I'm going to show you and all of that. And we'll see, like when I was in school, we had this thing where a few of us had invented this thing called the LLC. It was the Last Laugh Club. And I was like, oh, we're all going to be part of the Last Laugh Club because we're all going to get together and have the last laugh. And, I've always had that kind of, even as a child, this idea of I shall prevail. I don't know where it came from. I mean, now, of course, I understand. But as a child, I just had that in the face of so much of unpleasantness because I did encounter a lot of violence, a lot of, I would go as far as saying, well, not as far. I encountered abuse and violence, a lot of it, and quite frequently growing up, especially in my younger tween and teen years. And as that happened, I became even more aware of the fact that, this doesn't define me. I was, the idea was that just gave me even more and more sense of certainty that I'm not like you. And, so by the time I was 18, 19, it had really reached, the water was boiling, so to speak. It had reached a boiling point. I had made it very clear I wasn't going to do as told by my parents, my father especially. I wasn't going to be like bullied into submission, into, if you don't do this, you won't have this, that, and the other. And I was, I wasn't going to be in the closet or hide who I was. So I was just jarring in so many ways that the only way was either you would get cut off or you cut yourself off. And both happened to me.
Wow.
Both happened to me. Not only did I cut myself off, I even got cut off. And then I was like, and I think that was supposed to scare me into conformity. Like some of the other experiences in my childhood, like, if I didn't like something, if I thought something was unpleasant or scary, I was kind of encouraged to see it more because that would kind of toughen me up and all of those things.
When you say cut off, what do you mean?
It just means that, a little bit you're on your own. You have to fend for yourself.
No financial
Everything,
support,
all of
no
it.
place to live.
Yes. Well, you have to figure it out on your
gotta
own.
figure it
You're not
out,
going to get like a handout.
Yeah.
Like many of my friends and contemporaries had that support, and I just kind of realized that started waning for me, and I was like, I'm going to have to figure something out on my own. So I had to be more resourceful.
How did it feel?
At the time, I think I've had to process everything much in hindsight, because in that moment you're in survival mode. You're hypervigilant because I think you have practice. When you've experienced trauma growing up and you've experienced a lot of difficulties every 2-3 years, that kind of displacement, and then all the, you have to like find people who will protect you, and be and friends who will be there with you and be on your side all over again every single time. But just as you have to find those, you also experience new bullies every single time because you're the same person.
Yeah.
So you can that can be quite challenging by the time you get to that age, and you tell yourself that you're going to rely on yourself more, and you're going to channel everything you have into feeding your ambition, and that just it's what propelled me further at that age.
So you're in this position where you're at Ogilvy, you're doing the internship.
Yes.
The internship comes, and this is the context.
Yes,
you're
the internship's ended.
You're on your own.
Yeah.
You're having to fend for yourself.
Yeah.
Get money.
Yeah.
Place to live.
Yeah.
All these kind of things.
Well, I lived at the YMCA. I had to do that.
How did that?
That was very interesting.
What was the moment you walked in there and said, "I need a place"? Do you remember that?
Well, someone helped me get a place.
Right.
I had to ask because it wasn't easy. But I did get a bed initially, and I knew that that's just a place I'm going to have to figure this out. And I was very clear about the fact that I will figure this out. And
it wasn't even your own bed. You said
no,
you
it
had to
wasn't.
share it.
Yeah, we shared it because, in a sense, we didn't share a bed. I didn't share it with somebody.
Yeah.
But it was one of those places where it was a dorm, and someone had a job. And this guy, I think he worked in a call center or something like that. And he had the night shift. So, I had the bed to sleep on
During the
night, and then he would this
You
person.
go to
So I went to
Ogilvy.
no, I'd left Ogilvy by
Right.
then because it was just an internship. I didn't go back there for my final placement because by the time you finish your internship, finish your degree, and you go back into looking for work, I couldn't get hired there immediately. I had to go work elsewhere for 6 months before I got hired at another agency at Reader Fusion, which was Young and Rubicam. So that's what happened. And but those 6-7 months, I figured it out. I was like, well, that's a creative solution. I had friends in Bombay. They helped me out. So I stayed with some friends, and then I stayed at the Y. And then I got a job. And then I just kind of like made my way out of
Was
there.
this at the Times?
Yes, it was at the Times. So I worked at the Times for almost 9 months. Yeah.
And that was hard because at this stage, did you have your MBA?
Yeah. And I had to take that job. Yeah.
And you were applying for a job that was just an entry-level role.
Yes.
And only required an undergrad degree.
Yes.
You're there applying with the MBA.
With a double major from
Did
a
it-
very good school.
Did you feel like, where am I at in life? What is life?
Here's the thing. You have to say yes is what I learned. If you know, one yes will lead to another and another and another, because I was going to have to get my foot in the door and work my way in and out and up.
'Cause you needed money.
I
You
just
needed to
needed
earn.
everything.
Yeah.
Yes, I couldn't go home. Obviously, I didn't want to, and that wasn't an option for me at the time. So I just went like, you know what, I'm gonna go. And I didn't. Oh, I could have gone and worked for like some engineering company that made ball bearings, or some kind of IT company that made semiconductors, or go work at a bank. And those were all like the kind of jobs that MBA graduates were taking.
Yeah.
You know, and those were very prized placements, and I refused to go to those placement interviews. And that's again something that wasn't something that my father or my peers or my family might have actually clapped their hands in glee about. That, oh, well, that's just me saying, well, that's just really boring. It's not what I want to do.
Yeah.
And
Stuck to what you believed in.
yeah.
That dream of seeing those ads and getting involved in that world.
Yes. And so the job at the Times was, they were like, well, we need people to help us sell space in the advertising supplement, which is you sell ads.
Yeah.
And I was like, and that was something that people did after undergrad. And I was just like, okay, well, because I was applying because the advertising agencies were not coming to, the ones that came to our campus, they weren't the ones that I got hired at. And I didn't want to work for them because I wanted to work for a global advertising agency. It was very clear. It has to be, there were only 3 at the time. And if I can't get in there, I'm going to wait till I get in there. I just had that thing, like, I have to be in that space very clearly. And so when I went to that job interview, they're like, well, you're overqualified and overeducated for this. And I said, well, what's the job? I said, there's no such thing as being overqualified or overdressed. And, you know, he laughed. I remember, and he said, well, I said, what's the job? He said, well, listen, it's you're selling space. And I said, who are the clients? He's like, how do you do this? What's expected? He said, you know, you go to all the advertising agencies and meet people there and convince them to buy space in the Times.
And you're like, great.
And I was
can
just
go
like,
and meet
all the agencies.
advertising agencies.
That's exactly,
Brilliant.
yes, I'll take it. And I remember everyone was like shocked, like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? This is what this is the undergrad job. And I'm like, no, I'm doing this. And I said no to a campus placement. I could have gone and worked for an engineering company, like I said, in marketing. And I said, no, that's not what I want to do. So I went there, and it took me, 6 months? Because in 3 months of being there, you know, it took no time for this woman who ran the color magazine division, which owned the biggest glossy magazines, because the Times is huge in India. It owned all the publications. And that's the year Cosmopolitan was coming into the country, and she just owned all of that. She ran all of that, and she's like, you should be on my team, which was the very kind of like glossy and, you know, you would argue the slightly more glamorous side of the business, not just selling space in the top right-hand corner of the newspaper. So I said, well, that's really perfect. So in 3 months, I was working in that division. And in no time after that, I was in the agency world, because I was working with somebody who ran the Revlon business at Y&R, and we had a really good conversation. And one thing led to another, and I was an account executive on the Revlon business.
Wow.
And that was when I would say, you know, we clicked into gear, and I've never looked back since.
I love that.
Yeah.
What's the lesson from that story so far?
The lessons from there, I think, resilience and not losing sight ever of like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to do that conventional stuff. I'm not going to go and work somewhere that I don't want to work. I think there's a lot of merit in that whole mindset, because not many can hold out. It takes resilience. It takes taking the pain, of which you'd gone through a lot of that by that time, to really just go for it. And as you say, a yes can lead to a yes.
Yeah.
And then look where it took you.
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly when you know what you want a little bit, you never know exactly what you want, but you sort of know what you want.
Yeah.
I think it's when you know what, even if you have a slight idea of what you want, I feel from my experience, you have a much more specific idea of what you don't want.
Yes.
That is true for me. Like, even if your idea about what you want is slightly vague, your idea about what you don't want is always more specific. So if it is that, reject it. Listen to your intuition. Do not say yes to something that is very specifically within the criteria of what you don't want. Like, there's no need to do that.
So I think in less than a year from starting there, you got into the world of strategy.
Yes.
And how did that
less
happen?
than, yeah, that took no time.
And did you know strategy is my area, the area I want, or did you
Yes.
fall into it?
Yes. Well, when I was interning, I'd done that already.
I see. And
You
what
see,
did
when
you
I
like about it?
interned, they weren't looking for strategy interns at the time. It's another time. And I was like, well, I have to be at Ogilvy. I want to be there.
Yeah.
And I did manage to talk my way into that internship. But they said, well, the creative director needs a proofreader. You've got good command over the language. And they gave me a copy test. And I took a copy test. I did well in the copy test. So, well, you can proofread. And that's a really dull job, but an important one at that.
check
Because,
its spelling,
sometimes if you make a mistake in those days, you would manual artworks. There was a lot of, you had to be very good at that.
Yeah.
So commas and punctuation and all of that. So thank God I had a good education. I could just go like, yeah, I know the difference. Grammar was good and spelling was good and all of that. So I said, yeah, okay, well, I'll do the proofreading. But it took me, 4 or 5 weeks. And I remember he's a very temperamental creative director who would get really angry at badly written briefs. And then I just started doctoring the briefs so that he wouldn't get angry at the people. And then someone found out that I was doctoring the briefs. And they came up and spoke to me, this woman. By the way, that's a totally different thing. Every single time I've had this upgrade into the next portal, there's always been a woman who's helped me. Always.
Wow.
Always. I've been helped so much by people who've experienced and navigated the industry from a different point of view, because I feel like they saw me. And, and I think, and that is something I'm so passionate about doing as well. But anyway, back in the room. So when they did that, she said to me, she's like, well, are you doctoring these briefs? I'm like, I'm so sorry. And please, he's better this way. Everything's better. She was like, why don't you just come do this full time? I'm like, there's a full-time job where you can kind of just write briefs. And she's like, yes, it's called research and strategy. Come and join my team. So I did the rest of my internship with her. She was very sorry she couldn't hire me when time came because there were no vacancies at the time. But I knew I'd had the taste of what that job was.
I see.
And so when I came to YNR, I did Revlon for just a few months, and I was in strategy very quickly, because I think once you're in and people see what you're capable of and you know what you're capable of, you work your way into that space.
Yeah.
I did, and that's how it happened.
And so this is 1996 to 98. And then 98, how does Coca-Cola come into the story?
Yeah, so I wanted to do even better. And I was like, well, 96 to 98 was an interesting time. I did really well and, was on lots of pitches. And, you get a good get a good understanding of how the world of advertising is, all these different categories. You work with global teams and all of that. And I said, well, I have to be on a global career path. Because, I wanted to do that on my own merit, because I had a very clear idea, not just that I wanted to prove something to people who may have necessarily told me that all my choices weren't going to be constructive, or they weren't going to add up to something, whatever. But my thing was, no, I had to prove that also to myself. And I said, well, I want to be on a global career path. And I just realized that to be on that, you just need to be in a different playing field. And when I went and asked for that, they were like, well, you don't have enough experience.
So you're in your early 20s asking, I want to be on a global pathway.
Yeah, I mean, what does it take to be on that path, on that trajectory?
Not what many 20-year-olds are asking.
But not many 20-year-olds were like me.
That's very true.
Yeah, and I was just, when I wanted that, and the whole thing was, my understanding was, I was so used to the fact that what people would tell you is like, why you want good enough, why you won't fit into this, why you shouldn't be aiming this high, why this is out of your grasp. Like by this time in my life, that was just something like, I'm like, please tell me why you think I can't. It was almost like that. So because it's really important information, because you know exactly what you need to turn on its head. Because that's the universe just telling you, oh, that's the song you need to kind of like crank up the volume on. So, well, you know, you need to have more marketing experience, more client experience. You need to kind of like work on bigger brands. And that's when, you know, well, why can't I do that here? Well, there's people who've been doing this longer than you have, and they've got to be given the first chance and this, that, and the other. And I'm like, well, no, but this isn't the military service or the government service where just number of years decide how long you've done something, decides whether you should be even allowed to pitch yourself for put yourself forward for an opportunity. It was sort of like that. So I said, well, what do I have to do? Work for clients, work for a marketing company? What's the best marketing company in the country? And Coca-Cola was obviously the most prized job because they had just re-entered the country in the late 90s.
Wow.
And I said, well, I'm going to go and find a job at one of the biggest multinational companies, because that was the thing. So I applied to Nestle, and I applied to Coca-Cola, and I applied to Procter & Gamble. And I was just started to do that. And, you know, and I said, I'm not going to apply to any of our clients because that's going to look too easy. So, and also I didn't want to compromise. I was a little afraid that I'd get, you know, I might piss someone off for trying to get a job with a client who's part of the agency. So I really didn't. I looked outside of that. And I just started the process of applying and trying to find out what it takes. And I managed to get an information interview at Coca-Cola. And I met one person, then I met another person, and I got a job as an assistant marketing manager at Coca-Cola. And so I went there.
Yet again, manifested the goal.
So I said, I'm just going to go do that. And initially they were like, well, you know, the job is in the eating and drinking channel. It was retail marketing. I was like, okay, well, that's channel marketing. And I said, I'll do it because I want to learn. And I went and did that. And I got to work on some really interesting projects and engagements, learned how the business works, learned how you build a brand in a B2B and a channel marketing capacity, which is just as interesting than you do in a, you know, not regular, but like to a consumer person, people to people capacity. And it was great fun. I met lots of people, made lots of friends, and had a great 2 years there.
2 years there, and then back to Y&R.
Yeah, then I went to the States, actually, and then came back to Y&R, and they called me, and I remember having that conversation with one of my ex-bosses, and she said to me, she's like, if you want to come back, now's a good time. And I said, okay, and I did. And they set me up. They really looked after me after that.
What role was this that you went into?
I went in as a planning director.
Planning director. Okay.
Yeah, I came back and, you know, I got set up and I got to go on a secondment to Australia, and I got to go to work in the office in Singapore and help be part of the global team that built and launched the Brand Asset Valuator, which was the big tool study, empirically led and empirically evidenced brand building tool at Y&R in those days. And I was part of that team, and I got to build that and work on that in India and learn from teams in other markets as well. And, you know, just one thing led to another. And then I guess things just took off from there.
So this is really kind of a pivotal moment in your career as you start to work on big global projects and exposure and get up to director level. And this is where after this is where China comes into the picture.
Yeah.
And what were people saying to you about you going to China? How does it come up as an opportunity, and what were people saying to you?
Well, China was interesting. So I was working out of the Singapore office at the time, and you know, on a project. And as part of that was also learning from the team there. And she's an amazing woman, and she really helped me at Coke as well. and she was now running Pepsi for the region, marketing. And she said to me, she's like, you're doing really well, and you should. What do you want to do next? So how? And I said to her, I said, well, I met her just to talk, and I said to her, I said, I want to, work in more markets. I'm ready for, I want a global career path, and I want to I'm really curious about this. I've had lots of little stints in different markets. I think I want to kind of like really focus on a growing market that is in India. And, I want to go and do that. And I didn't want to just go back to the States or go to Canada or any of that stuff. I just wanted to work my way there through the industry, not through just like, okay, go back there and then start from there. I wanted to chart a path. And she gave me some really good advice. And she said, you should, BBDO in Shanghai is a really good agency, and you should talk to them. I said, will you help broker an introduction for me? And she did broker an introduction for me. She introduced me to a couple of people who I emailed and talked to them. And as it turned out, they were willing to have a conversation. And so I had a conversation over the phone, and then we had a couple of emails, and then I got invited to come and show up for the interview. And that was the basis upon which I was either going to end up working there or not. And the interview itself was an extremely interesting experience. I don't know if I've ever told you what happened.
No.
So he says to me, this guy who was running the operation in China, why don't you come to Shanghai on Thursday? I said, okay, well, I'll come on Thursday. What time? He said, you should meet at 8:30 in the morning at my office. Okay, that's fine. So my office will send you the address, or we'll put you up for a couple of days when you come in. We'll send you the address, and we'll send you the address of the hotel, of the agency. Sure. Now, I've never been there, obviously. And in my world, I'm thinking, oh, yeah, I've kind of, I'm quite worldly. I've traveled. I'm going to figure this out, And so I get the address over the email and show up. I arrive there. And it's a very regular address. It says 500 Yan'an Road West. And, I'd been in the States before that. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's just like any other. It's an address. It's number, direction, street. Now, when I get there, this is 2002. I get to China. It's just at the end of SARS, so it's quite kind of like a bit difficult. And you get there. First, you realize, oh my God, I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to get a cab. Because I just thought, I'm just going to walk out, hail a cab. I'm just so New York. I'm going to walk out, hail a taxi, get a taxi. And then I'm going to go to the hotel or whatever, stay there on whatever road west. And then I'm going to just show up with my 2 Starbucks coffees and be like, hey, let's talk. I thought that's how I kind of like. Little did I know, it was just a project getting a cab. And then I realized, hey, I have to explain where I have to go. And, the word that he didn't understand me because I didn't speak Mandarin at the time. So it was quite a project because it took almost 2 hours. We were driving and he did his very best because, I kept repeating the address for him. The name of the street was fine, but, West, the word in Mandarin is very different. The numbers, the characters are very different. But, and that street is one of the longest streets in Shanghai. And it's like, it's really hard to kind of like find that. And so the lovely man that he was, he just said, I'm not going to abandon you. So he just kept going. And I'm really getting. And then I see from the corner of my eye, the Westin Hotel sign. And I'm like, go there. We're going to go there. No, I wasn't staying there. I was put up somewhere else.
Oh, right.
But in that moment, at about midnight or something, I don't know why. It's like, we're going to go there. And we walked in there. And I remember tearing through the lobby going like, does somebody speak English? And someone was really nice there. The lady at the concierge, she's like, yeah, what do you want? I can help you. And I said, well, I'm trying to get to this address. She said, do you have the Chinese address? I'm like, no. She's like, you need to know. Every name has a Mandarin equivalent, and you need to know your address in Mandarin so you can actually get to where you have to go to. Yeah. So please, can you help me out? So she wrote it for me on a piece of paper. At that minute, I said to her, I have a meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30. can you write me this address as well, please?
Smart.
Yes.
And she said, I will. And she did. And that's when I went like, don't ever assume anything. So got to my hotel, woke up, next day, very confident, showed up at 15 minutes before the meeting time. I'm waiting for him at the office. And he looked at me and he's like, you made it. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, and I said to him, I said, well played, because...
He knew what he was
that was
doing.
it.
Yeah,
That was
he
the
knew
first
what he
test.
was
Test.
Yeah.
And that's what he said. He says, you're going to be okay here.
Wow. The interview before the interview. Can you even get here?
And he was an amazing mentor to me. Like, he opened many doors for me after that. He's a wonderful, wonderful man.
And you spent 4 years in China.
Yeah.
And you worked with Visa, PepsiCo, FedEx, Dulux, Procter & Gamble, Chrysler, Sony.
Yeah, all of them.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Accomplishments. He led the strategy and consumer insight initiative for Visa that culminated in an internationally recognized successful local advertising campaign specifically for China.
Yeah, for the first time. Yeah.
Pretty big stuff.
Yeah, we invented a potato chip.
Are you an agency or brand that would like to work with our production company, Unity and Motion? If so, contact us at unityandmotion.com. We produce commercials and social content for brands such as Chanel, Amazon, Reebok, Harrods, The Ritz, and many more. Now back to the show.
Invented a potato chip.
Well, the agency did. I was part of the team that did that. Yeah.
How cool.
Yeah.
So your career's going very well and you're on your pathway. You are just determined to have this global role. Where'd you go next? What happens next?
After that, I went back to Canada.
You've
When
been
I
in
finished.
Canada before?
Yes. So, I'd finished this and I'd never worked there, obviously. So between China, after Shanghai, I was spending a lot more time in Berlin because I was working on Allianz, and I was spending time between Shanghai and Berlin a lot. The time came, I just realized that all my next moves, everything that was coming my way was to remain in Asia. And do you want to be in Hong Kong, or do you want to move to Thailand, or do you want to go to Japan, or do you want to go back to Singapore? It's like, no, I need to go to New York. That's where I want to go, because I need to do something that's different. I need to do something that's not here. If I'm going to do, and I'd like to kind of, work in a different part of the world. I'd already worked in India. I'd already experienced what it was to live in Asia Pacific. I'd done a regional role there. I'd been to all the markets. I was genuinely curious. I was only 29.
Wow.
I was like, no, there's more. I don't want to sit here and be one of those expats. Nothing against them, but I wasn't one of them to just be like, I'm just going to get really comfortable living in Asia Pacific. I could have just stayed there, continued learning Mandarin and, all of those things. I have many friends who stayed there for 10, 15, 20 years. And
you wanted this, you needed this globalized knowledge of global markets.
I wanted to experience the world.
Right.
And I realized that I could, I applied for work. And at the time, I have to say, BBDO did try very hard, but it was difficult, with visas and all of that. It's not that easy, especially, as the moves get more and more tricky. It does get difficult. But at that point in time, they did help me relocate to Toronto, and I ended up working for Leo Burnett over there, and worked for Gray, and very quickly I found myself in New York. So Toronto was it was like I moved to Toronto to kind of like, basically also decompress and, get back into the North American region and work in that environment and get acquainted with those clients and in that industry. And I got headhunted, and then I moved to New York quite quickly after that.
So you go from senior strategy partner at Cossette,
Yes.
and then vice president of strategic planning when you moved to Leo Burnett, that's in Toronto, and then senior vice president and head of strategy at Gray.
Yes.
So you're really rising up the ranks every
Yes.
time. All through this period, are you still cut off from your family? Are you speaking to them? You've
Yes.
obviously made this huge
I'm focusing on myself.
transformation since, being at the YMCA. You're no longer sharing a bed with someone. You know?
Well, I never really shared a bed with
So
him, but taking turns.
Taking turns. Yeah. What is the relationship with your family at this point?
Cordial. I was very focused on work. I was really enjoying it, and I was having my own setbacks and learning from them. And this isn't something that it wouldn't be like I'd just wake up the next morning and be like, oh, here's your next move. I was working quite consciously on creating this path for myself. Like this is all I had committed myself to this journey. And that was what I was in a relationship with at the time.
Yeah.
At what point? I mean, obviously, when you go off and you begin sort of forging your own destiny, maybe family members are thinking, well, let's see how long before he comes back. At what point do you think they realised, oh, he's really making something of himself, and we're proud of him?
Well, I think deep down they always knew. My mother and father both knew. Here's the thing about my parents. They're both extremely strong and very kind of like individually driven people. So I think they might have known that, he's probably not going to be quite like the way we would have expected him to make the choices, the ones we would have liked him to make, or turn out the way we would have wanted him to turn out like. But I think they knew that the apple doesn't fall that far from the tree. I was going to kind of keep myself going and make choices and move forward with, pick myself up and keep moving, because that's their story as well. So they're very kind of unapologetic and strong and strong-willed people. Wasn't going to be like some completely diffident doormat. So that was to be expected. I just wasn't strong and, opinionated in the same way they are.
Would you, for example, you get this senior vice president and head of strategy at Grey Group, massive agency, very big role. Would you call them and say, hey, I've got this new role?
No, because I wasn't doing it for that. I mean, obviously it'd come up in a conversation that, oh, I'm working here now. But, and also I think advertising as an industry wasn't something my parents were, quite acquainted with. They didn't know what this group versus the other group and what's the difference between this title or that title. My mum would just say, like, are you happy? Is this what you want to do? Are you enjoying it? And yeah. In fact, my mother and I, we were very close, and she would talk to me about, she would just be like, well, are you happy? And when I wasn't happy, I remember saying that to her when I was, there was a point in my career which was very difficult. And I said to her, it's really, really quite challenging. And she said to me, she said, well, then do something about it. Well, it's challenging. She was like, well, it's not the most challenging thing you've encountered, have you? She just reminded me of what I'd already overcome. And sometimes that's all you need, I was like, wait a minute, of course. She's like, well, you know how to do this. So
what a brilliant voice to have, with you on your shoulder. So, and then, what happens next? You said you moved to New York, and this is where the journey of up the ranks of McCann begins. How does
13 years ago,
you got headhunted or?
Yeah, well, I would say headhunted. I had a call. Someone called me.
Who?
Well, from one of the people from talent team at Interpublic, Brian, called me.
And Interpublic is the holding company that McCann Worldgroup is part of.
Yes. So Brian called me, and Brian's office called me, actually, and I got a call. And I remember thinking to myself, it was Mother's Day the weekend prior, and I'd gone to meet my mother, and my mother and I were in Paris the weekend before because, it was just that we thought we'd just take a little trip. So I met my mother in Paris, and I'd spent 5 good days with her, and we had a lovely trip. And it was on the way back. It was that, when that... what was that volcano in Iceland?
The ash.
Yes, that thing had gone off,
Yeah.
and our flights were cancelled indefinitely, and they were like, it was quite a difficult time to get out of there. And we were going to go to 2 different terminals because I was flying to Toronto, she was going elsewhere, and all of that. And I remember having this really long and intense conversation with my mum and saying, there are certain things that are really difficult, and I don't know if this is really it. I feel like there's more, and that this isn't what, I just don't feel like this is the place for me, because there was stuff going on. And that's when she said to me, she's like, well, if you then do something about it, put it out there and do something about it. I said, well, okay. And I remember thinking that to myself, it's just like miraculously, you can't write this. I came back, walked into my office, which is the Monday, picked up my messages, because those days people left voicemails, and I had a message from his office, from Brian's office. I thought it was a crank call. I never responded to it.
Really?
It was. I mean,
joke.
I wasn't in a great place at the time, because I was like,
Wow.
I'm sure someone's pulling a fast one.
Yeah.
And but 24 hours later, I mean, his assistant wrote to me. She's like, well, we left you a voice message. Would you like to have a conversation? I'm like,
What was his role at the time?
he was head of talent. He looked for.
Right,
He was
I
out.
see.
His job was finding talent and
Yeah.
bringing them into public, finding talent all over the world. He's an amazing, amazing man. He's still someone who advises me, and still someone who I have so much respect for. And he has since retired, but Brian is one of those people. Like I said, it's always been a woman, and then there was Brian.
Okay.
I spoke to him, and we met, and we had a great conversation, and I put my trust in Brian's hands, and he said, well, I'm going to introduce you to a few people, because I think you're ready for. It's like that. It happened for me.
Mm.
And what was the role he was suggesting you were ready for?
To move to meet people at McCann in New York. And
Was there a particular job
yes,
on the table?
there were several.
Okay.
There was more than one that I could have done.
Oh.
And then, of course, I met lots of people, and we agreed. We all, we established that there was one that was going to be really a good job for me to do, and that was to run General Mills, which was one of the largest clients, huge American client, hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, General Mills, they make all the cereals and food and all of that, and it's like properly, like, that for me was like, I just wanted to sink my teeth into that, because I said, that's what going to America, working in America on something massively that is so distinctively American and populist, that's what I wanted to do. And I really wanted that job. And he was so amazing that he just saw that I would be a good fit for it. Of course, I met lots of people, went through the process, and ended up working on General Mills and running it.
Wow. And how did that feel when you got your hands on it? And did you feel like, yes?
It was touch
I've
and go,
worked
to be
many
honest.
years for this. And
Yes. But it was touch and go, Charles, because when I went there, initially I was like, oh, I'm going to get this job. And we agreed that I'd be a good fit for it. The US consulate has to give you an appointment to get a visa,
Of course, yeah.
you do that. And the appointment was almost 4 or 5, almost 6 months out.
Ooh.
And we had so much there was a greater urgency to fill the position. And once again, Devika Bulchandani, who was the person who ran, she was the woman. Devika now runs Ogilvy Worldwide, as you know. But Devika at the time was the Chief Strategy Officer. And she said to me, she's like, we'll wait for the right person. Don't worry about it. Devika waited for me.
Oh,
wow.
Yeah,
Wow. 6
she
months.
said, we'll figure this out. You're right for McCann. And one more time, like I said, I've always had, when you put that much into yourself and you have put yourself out there, I think you will meet people that will match your energy and your vibration.
definitely.
You will meet people who will take as much of a chance on you as you have taken a chance on yourself to put yourself out there. I mean, Devika was there. She's like, well, wait. And I was like, what? Yes. And so they helped expedite the appointment. Instead of 6 months, it took 4.5, 5 months. And I was there, and I've been there ever since.
What was your first role? What's the job title? Do you remember?
I of course I remember my job title. I joined McCann New York first as SVP Group Strategy Director for General Mills, and then I became the EVP Global Strategy Director because we ran the business. Then I got to build and run the business globally.
Was that your first global role?
my global client leading, my global role leading a client, yes.
Did you feel at that point like, this is what I've been working towards? Finally, I've got this global remit, or you wanted more?
No, it's not like wanted more. I just knew like this was for me a thing that things are in the right direction.
I see.
You know, I've always focused on the direction. You know, it's important to focus on direction for me versus destination, because when you say it's exactly that, I think you could be undercutting yourself.
Yeah.
That's all that your imagination can imagine. So, you know, I think I prefer to focus on the direction. And I was like, well, this is in the right direction. And that's how one thing led to another after that.
What was under your remit in this position?
It was to run a portfolio of General Mills brands globally. We had a hub in Australia, in Dubai, in London, and in Paris, and in the US, and in Mexico. And so I worked with all those teams, and we ran the portfolio very successfully all over the world and made amazing work, and created just very, very interesting solutions that are still relevant and still interesting. So yeah, it was real fun because you worked on brands like Betty Crocker, and you worked on brands like Nature Valley, and you worked on brands like Hamburger Helper, and then you worked on brands like Pillsbury. So it was just really interesting. And I worked with Leslie Sims. She was the creative director at the time. We had a great partnership.
And what were you learning at this point about? You'd had a lot. I want you to explain about what people had said to you over the time, and the limits people tried to put on you, or what advice people gave you, and what had you learnt by this point about that? So for people listening who are having people constantly tell them, that's not right for you, or you're not going to make it in China. You need to speak the language. You're not going to fit there.
Yeah.
You're not going to fit here. Anybody listening who gets a lot of that, what had you learnt at this stage about taking on feedback from others?
Well, I think feedback is purely based on what people know. That's their reference and that's their experience. So there are a couple of things that I've learned about this. One is every time someone tells you something that, oh, you can't or you shouldn't, it's because probably that's been their reality.
Yeah.
And my whole thing is, I'm sorry that was your experience. That's the way you just move on. Here's the thing. Potential is very, 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 and there are 3 berries here, very personal. Nobody can tell you what your potential is. I think it's incredibly important to remember that. Your potential is an incredibly personal thing. So people can only tell you what they know, what's been true for them, what their experiences and references have led them to believe what's become their reality. It's not necessarily your reality. We're all different. We're all unique. We have our own journeys. We have our own understanding of the world. We're not supposed to have the exact same experience like everybody else. So no, that's your experience, and thanks for sharing it with me, but please don't insist that needs to be mine too. So I think that's really very, very important.
And you have to, you've mentioned to us before, it's really important who you give the keys, who you give permission to shape you,
Yes.
to direct you, who you will actually listen to their feedback.
Yes.
How important is that? And how do you do that? How do you decide on those people?
Very well. The short answer is that you can't. If you're going to take advice from everybody, then you're not going to accomplish very much, will you? So I think the more important thing is, because most of the times when you're not like everybody else, one thing is, and you have a clear idea about what you want, or at least a clear idea about the direction. People will tell you, oh, I think that might be aiming for too much. That might be too much for you. Or don't aim so high. Or be more, what's the word that absolutely, humble. Be more humble. Don't put yourself out there like that. Don't reach like that. And I think you have to really ask yourself, who is telling you that? That's when you realize who's telling you that. Because in my experience, I've realized many times, if not most times, people who are telling you that are people for whom you don't fit their understanding and their set of references and beliefs and experiences of what someone who looks like you, walks like you, talks like you, presents like you, should, could, or can accomplish. The minute you're outside that, that's just, they will correct you and tell you, well, you know what, you don't be too much for that. Sometimes it could be even your own family members, parents, because that's been their experience. Sometimes they will tell that, I'm protecting you. Don't put yourself out there like that. Or don't be so ambitious. Or don't be so forthright. Or don't be so clear and demanding about what you want to do. Don't ask so much of yourself. And that's not necessarily something you need to absolutely obey.
And what do you do with that? How do you handle that?
I'm so sorry that was your experience.
Yeah.
You know, it's compassion. You have to have, compassion. You know, I have this thing. I call it LCD. It's like, first, you have to receive that feedback with love. If somebody's telling you that, you have to give some sense of, like, you obviously must be wishing well for me, which is why you're telling me that. And you can't get angry about it. Compassion. I'm so sorry that's been your experience. It must have been hard that you haven't been able to accomplish that. And then you distance yourself from it and be like, well, I do know what you think my potential is now. So that information is gold. You know exactly what to do now.
So if I'm listening to this and I'm in a senior role and I'd love to get to a C-suite role, and this is your next transition, is to go from a EVP, as you said, to Chief Strategy Officer at McCann Worldgroup. What did you do? What did you demonstrate? How did you get yourself in a position where McCann are going, yes, Harjot is the man for this Chief Strategy Officer role?
Well, before that, I became Chief Strategy Officer for Europe.
Yes.
So I came to do that job. And it was really, I think, it's not like you doing anything different. It's about just being good at what you're doing. And it's really not rocket science, because I think you have to also know that you're surrounded by people who see you. Like, I really do believe that I've had my bad experiences, just like everybody else has. But I was in a place where I was seen. I was seen at McCann from the very first day, even before I started. So it's a great place where, I felt seen and appreciated and recognized. And, I knew I was in the right place, because the best thing is sometimes, you've got champions around you when they can smell, sense, and intuitively know you're ready before you think you are. That's happened for me. It's not always been me, especially at McCann. It's happened for me.
So you should make sure you're in a place where, one, you feel like people see you and see your value and see you who you really are. And
whose journeys you relate to, and whose journeys you admire, and whose work ethic you appreciate, whose values you can ascribe to. You want to be around that energy. You have to be in an orbit where the energy works with your energy. You have to share that. So and it's not the right orbit for everyone, is it? So I'm in the right orbit. I was in the right orbit, where, I'm for someone who, like me, who's moved as much as I have. I mean, it's the most stability I've had in my life. I always say McCann is my second longest monogamous relationship, almost 13 years. So I've had a lot of stability here and a lot of excitement here. So you have to be around people like that. And McCann, when I'm surrounded by people, the leaders are all people who've had very incredible career paths and journeys themselves. It's like you suddenly come to a place and you realize you're surrounded by people like yourself who have pushed themselves forward and lifted people as they've climbed and shared what they've learned, so that made sure that they've helped shortcut the time for other people, because, you don't have to. What's the use of learning and knowing all this if everybody's going to take just as long as you did to make their own mistakes? If you can help people avoid some mistakes by sharing your story, then that's good. So I am and was surrounded by that energy. So that's also what's moved me forward. So McCann saw I was ready, I knew I was ready for something different, but the Europe job came, and
How did it come?
we were rebuilding the region, and that role was there, and we'd hired new leadership in the region. And at McCann we are hugely believers in kind of promoting and moving talent internally and growing talent. And I was one of the people that was considered for that role, and I went through a process just like everybody else would. And the fact that I had that conversation, and I remember thinking, oh yeah, I am ready for this. So I would not have known that if I hadn't had a conversation with someone who said to me, I think you're ready for this, and you should give it a shot. And then I went there and I realized that, this is very different from anything I've done. It was a stretch unlike anything I'd experienced, because here I was not running a client. Now McCann was my biggest client in the region, and I wasn't running just one client. I was responsible for running many others, and I was a leader of leaders. People's career paths and people's growth, and our collective product, creatively and strategically. That's what I was here to kind of like protect and preserve and improve the quality of, and take to the next level.
How did you equip yourself to be ready for this role and grow into it?
I had a lot of help. I had great coaching, and I had great partners, and it's really and self-awareness. Really, I mean, it's.
Do you have
not very
advice for
sophisticated.
someone who's starting in a C-suite role, the first, or a chief strategy officer role, and going to look after the agency rather than the brands? What advice do you have to share about that first period?
Don't second guess yourself. I think is the first thing I would say, because you've done this before in another iteration, so in another way. One of the big things is that the playbook isn't any different. You're still here championing good people, good work, and you're here to create the conditions where the best minds want to make their best work. So you have to create a space where people actually want to make their best work, want to make their boldest work. So you just have to be good at life to be a good leader, is what I would say. Just be switched on in that way.
And you feel that as chief strategy officer, and you're chief strategy of Europe at this time for McCann Worldgroup, that's your role, is to create an environment where people can do their best work.
That is the most important part of your job. It's not the only thing you do, obviously, but it is perhaps, in my experience, the most important thing that you do, is to kind of create the conditions where people can actually do their best work and accomplish more and achieve more that they can, because of your presence and your influence and you just being there. The fact is that if you weren't there, people would. How much does your being there help the teams be more? And I think that is how you evaluate your contribution and your impact.
What do you think you've done that's had the biggest impact on that?
One thing?
One? Many? What advice do you have for someone who's listening, who they're maybe in your role, or they're just running a business and they want to create the best environment for their teams to do the best work? What advice do you have to enable them to do that?
Have a very clear idea about what success means, and have a very clear idea about what are the values and conditions that will drive that success. And share that. That has to be shared. So that's the first thing, I think. The second one is have a strong community. Invest in building a community. That's really, really important, because, at the end of the day, you're only as strong as your leaders. So you have to build a community of leaders, and you have to invest in it. It's not just a thing that, we'll get people together once in a while. No, that's really important. And,
Any strategies for doing that well?
What would you say your 3 points on investing in a team would be for success?
Shared success. Shared vision of success is the first thing. I think you have to include people in being able to chart out what that is. People have to believe that they have genuinely, like I said, being good at life, you have to genuinely believe that you've had agency in creating the narrative and the goal. People, it's hard to expect people to want to conform or believe in something they've had absolutely no agency in creating, especially if you're working with bold, creative minds. I mean, I know that firsthand. So first thing is to be inclusive and expansive in that sense. And then, of course, you need trust and community, where you have to be able to keep each other honest.
Yeah.
And then you have to be completely generous with each other and honest. So it's not a very sophisticated answer, I'm afraid, but it is the answer that works for me. So it comes down to just being being a good leader comes down to being a really good human being.
Yeah.
I think the most profound and impactful and valuable things are very simple.
Yeah.
It's easy to complicate things. And often when someone is an expert at what they do, they can explain it in very simple terms, which is what you're able to do. Your next role is a global role, Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann. How does that come about, and what are you feeling at this time? Are you excited? Are you nervous?
All of the above.
What were you nervous about?
It happened during the pandemic, and it completely, my whole playbook, everything that I'd learned on how to do my job well was something that I wouldn't have access to, that bag of tricks, so to speak. I'm someone who learned to make an impact by being in the markets, working with people on real engagements, having shared experiences, just those memories, and creating those experiences, and being part of those victories and architecting those and having the highs and lows with them and building something together. That was all so hard during the pandemic when this happened. So I was like, well, we're going to do this on Teams. And that was something that was uncomfortable for me. And then I realized, well, it's uncomfortable for everyone. So, and once again, is this the most uncomfortable thing you've dealt with? Just remember, like, hell no. So we'll figure this out. And that I did have that moment where I was like, oh my God, my entire bag of tricks has been rendered obsolete by this, because the only way I know how to do this is to, I'm a tactile person, be in it, something. And it wasn't easy, but we managed. We did really well, despite that.
And this is the time that we met. We started talking.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
I remember having that conversation with you, and he's like, do you have any opinions on stuff? And I'm like, I'm a pinata of opinions.
That was one of our favourite comments at the time. I'm an opiniata.
Of opinions.
Oh, love it.
I don't know. Well, I think I might have read it somewhere or not, or just conjured it up, but whatever. That's how I remember introducing myself to you, didn't I?
Yeah, that's right. And you were full of them. You came to our Unified Creative roundtables and panel discussions.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And we were talking about, how do we unify the industry? What are the biggest challenges? Most importantly, what are the solutions? And you've got, great opinions and perspectives on how things could be different. I think because you've seen and experienced so many things that do need to be improved in the industry.
Yes.
What do you think, what are you most passionate at the moment about? What needs to change in the industry?
It's such a good question, because some of the things are still very fundamental things. We just need to continue to remind ourselves. I talk to people and I just think that we just need to just remember that it's easy to complicate things. You need to go back to the fundamentals. Let's never forget that different is good. Because here's the thing. In retrospect now, I think this is the industry that invented the whole concept of a point of difference. We learn that in marketing theory and brand theory. People pay more for a point of difference, or brands. Differentiation commands a premium, and all of that. And we've also learned that you can't, this is just, what's true in life is true in advertising. That has been the biggest learning of my life. And I keep telling people that for me, that's the biggest learning. of course, I've been fortunate enough to, I've had to work my ass off and get an education and do all of that stuff like everybody else. But the biggest learning is that what's true in life is true in advertising, because here's the thing: you can't make different, do different, unless you think different, and you are different. So embrace that. Just to stop expecting people to just fit in and disappear, because that's not what we do. That's the first thing. And I think the other thing is, what is your point of difference? It's your point of view. And I think we have to actually create an industry which celebrates a different point of view, which actually makes it safe and lucrative for people with bold and different points of view and sets of references to actually come out there and share them and be them and make them real for people and in their lives. So that's so important. And that's what I mean by creating the industry where the best minds want to do their boldest, best work. That only comes from having really different references and beliefs. So those are things that I think this industry, we just need to continuously remember that, we need to create an industry which celebrates the point of difference. We can't just say that that's something we do for brands, but how are you going to make that if in the industry you only are creating an environment where everyone who just looks like everybody else, thinks like everybody else, talks like everybody else, goes to the same schools, makes the work?
Yeah.
It doesn't quite happen like that. I don't know. I've had countless, hundreds of pitches. I've never been to one where the clients have said, "Oh, well, please can you show us some advertising that looks just like everybody else's?" Never happened. Never happened. How many meetings have you been to where people have said, "Can you show us something that makes us a little uncomfortable? We want something that's a bit bold, a bit uncomfortable." Or sometimes you've lost a pitch and you're like, "Oh, they really made us uncomfortable with the work." How are you going to make people uncomfortable with the work if you don't challenge your own perceptions and your held beliefs and references? So I think as an industry, we just have to continuously commit to that. That is not just something we should be talking about in panels. That is our oxygen. That is the only way we'll be future-proof.
Yeah.
So, if I have to choose one thing, that's where I would focus on.
It's like I heard an analogy of beehives. So you have a colony of bees, let's say. 80% of them, once they've found a good source of pollen, 80% will keep going to the same patch and going back to the hive. The other 20% will go off in any random direction. And it's those 20% that then find new sources that then allow the hive or the colony to continue, because they find the new sources and bring that back.
Yes. Hence that expression of cross-pollination.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to use that.
It's a good one. Ashley has brilliant analogies.
Yeah.
I'm blessed with hearing many every day. January 2023, you are appointed Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann Worldgroup. That's all of the agencies within the McCann Worldgroup. What do you think your father thinks about what you've achieved?
Oh, we just hung out last week, Dad and I. It was his 80th birthday earlier in May.
Beautiful.
Like I said, things are different now. I'm older. He's older.
What was there?
I've been doing this for 27 years.
Is there a certain moment where you feel like he recognised that, okay, you went on your own path, and at the time I didn't think it was right, but I understand now what this world of advertising is and how successful you've been?
Well, yes, he's had a lot of time to learn and educate himself as well. When I think when he was curious about the industry, and he's read books on it, and he's watched Mad Men like everybody else has. And, he now, in India, you still have key numbers in the magazines, and he looks at them. And sometimes if he's seen something when he's traveling or whatever, he'll ask me, "Did you make that? Were you involved in that?" So I have to keep reminding him. I said, "No, I didn't get to actually make that. I might 6, 7, 8 degrees of separation. I may have touched it in some obtuse way, but it's really there." And he said something really interesting to me the other day. He's like, "Well, that's really then you did. Then you should think that's an important contribution, even if you haven't directly been involved. That still is even 7, 8, 10 degrees of separation from it, of course, because he has to liken it to the army, everything like But he did say something to me about leadership and about contribution that I've never forgotten. And he said, it's like as you become more and more senior in your role and you have a more expansive scope of responsibility, he said to me, think of being like salt in the water. And I was like, what is that? He's like, you don't have to be visible, but you have to be palpable. You can taste it. So he's like, and I just was like, that's a really good thing for me to remember. He said that to me. He's like, at the end of the day, when because that might have been his experience, like, you can't possibly go and do everything in every unit or every regiment or whatever. So he said the good leaders, he's like, they're just salt. They're like salt. Their impact is palpable. It's felt. You don't have to be visible in the front doing it every single time. Your presence and your impact, people should be able to taste it.
I see.
And I think for me, I do keep that in mind, and I do use that as a way to evaluate the impact I'm having or making or helping other leaders in my orbit to make as well, because that's the job. We're all about helping more leaders be even more impactful. That's the job.
I think it's really, I'm glad we got to tell this beautiful story of, your father and where the relationship is at now, which sounds really lovely. What advice do you have for anybody listening who hasn't maybe repaired relationship with close family, loved ones? Any messages to them?
I think, it's just take your time, but be honest, do it in your own time is what I would say. I mean, you can't be in a rush. You have to take the time to heal if you need to, and everybody's different, but try and make the most of this lifetime because, as you advance in age, what's the expression? The days may feel long, but the years get shorter. And, it's really important to remember that, that you don't have a lot of time. And so how do you want to use your time? And that's really a very subjective and personal thing. So how long do you want to carry this with you? If you have taken the time to heal, put that healing to good use. So how do you know if let's say, when I tore my meniscus in my knee, how do I know that it was okay? I only knew it was okay if I could go to a spin class again. When I tore my meniscus, I couldn't go to a spin class for a while, but when it was back on, I only knew it was okay when I could go to a spin class again. I feel it's a bit like that. So, don't waste the healing, just apply it and share it. And, you'll do yourself a favor too.
Well, if that's not a good message to end on, I don't know what is. You'll know when you're ready to go to a spin class.
Yeah.
We like to end these. Is there any final words you'd like to say?
Final
say?
words.
We'd like to end with a poem. We've got that coming. I'll do a summary of what I think the lessons are from your life.
A final word. That I do actually. I think it's really important to not apologize for being yourself. To be unapologetic isn't just something about, being sassy and being fierce or being lippy or being whatever. It's your job. I think it's the biggest favor and the biggest obligation you owe to yourself is to not apologize for being who you are and being yourself. And, that is my life's motto. Do not dim your light. You're not here to do that. People can go figure out, let them get shades, let them get sunglasses, let them do what they need to do. Your point of view is valid. Don't dim your light. You're here to shine, and don't apologize for your light. That's what I want to say. It's the only thing that matters at the end of the day.
Beautiful. Thank you. Lovely way to put it. Okay, so a summary of what I think the lessons from your life are for people watching is that just that real ability, if you've mastered the art of what to do with other people's feedback and what to do with what other people think of you, which is, as you said, just say thank you. Okay, that's your perspective. Appreciate it. You clearly, you've got
It
love for
doesn't
me.
spark joy.
There we go, Marie Kondo. And I think that's so important and not often talked about and maybe undervalued, because it's, if you listen to everybody, you'll go in all sorts of directions. You'll go in a different direction every day. So you do choose who you listen to, and that choice is super important. And a lot of times you've looked inwards and gone, what am I really about? What do I really, really want to do? What ignites that light inside of me, and how can I make that shine brighter? I'm going to go for that. No matter what other people say to me, I'm going to push forward for that. And I'm going to arrange my life and career to allow those things to happen with unwavering focus. And I think there's massive value in that. And you've got to that role. You wanted a global role. You're now Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann Worldgroup, one of the most successful, award-winning and effective agencies on the planet, which is amazing and I think very inspiring. So thanks for sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Now for the final poem.
So I make this one up as we go along, so you may have seen me scribbling here and there. And I think the one thing that I really take from all of this is the LCD. When you're having feedback or someone's talking about an aspect of yourself, to take that with love, to see the love in it first, to then apply compassion for yourself and the individual, and to then distance yourself if you need to know what's in your head, and how you feel, as opposed to the projection of someone else upon you and upon yourself. I think that's very, very powerful. Here we go. Stories, experiences, and lessons, too many to mention. Seeing that one should never blindly follow the norm, as it leaves no space for reinvention. You can move on up with determination, and yes can lead to more yes. And know that you can never be too overqualified or to be too overdressed. To move towards a global space, it takes a concerted choice. And to get the right feedback from peers and seniors, don't ever be afraid to raise your own voice. If you find out what success means to you, you will thrive and never be stale. So practice being good at life and let your authentic self prevail.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Inspired by yourself. Thank you for joining us today.
There we go. And that is how you became Global Chief Strategy Officer of McCann Worldgroup. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.